Hello, good afternoon. Hopefully, people are managing to come in as well into the webinar. Let's have a look. Martin and Eddie are already here. Okay, let's wait a couple of more minutes and then we'll start properly. But I can also start just kind of with intro a little bit before we get into the webinar and workshop bit. So today we'll focus on experimentation maturity, meaning that what are the tools that help you grow and scale your experimentation programs. So I'm Annika Thompson, and I'm a director of services here at Speero. Speero is a global experimentation and website optimization agency. We were founded in 2010, and we have always kind of believed in elevating this industry. So from the get-go, Bear Player's blog became the industry's kind of guiding source of information. And even today, we keep on publishing all our frameworks, processes, and ways of working. So hopefully that's all helpful for everyone in experimentation. And yeah, we have clients globally, which is also the reason why the four of us have met here today. So we have Shiva, who will give us an overview of what experimentation maturity is and why it's important. So he has done a lot of work on how we measure and help companies at Speero to improve their programs in terms of maturity. And currently he's in-house and setting up a new program, ground up. Then we have Lucia, who is a senior strategist at Speero and has worked with Luke on a joint client. And the client is a beauty and cosmetics retailer out of Australia. Luke is at SiteSpect, which is a server-side A/B testing tool that we've been using with the client. And Luke and Lucia will give us examples on how they have helped this retailer on scaling their experimentation program. And then finally, as the last bit of this webinar workshop, we will actually go into a hands-on workshop to show you how to use maturity audits and how you can find your own program's kind of strengths and weaknesses, and how you can kind of create a strategy on how to improve and scale your programs. So I will be opening up the Q&A panel. Feel free to post any questions as they arise, and if we can't answer them straight away, we'll just go through them in the workshop part later on. So yeah, that's it. Ready to go. Shiva, mic to you.
Cool. Thank you very much. So yeah, kind of just went over some of the things that we're going to be doing today. So let's go ahead and jump into experimentation maturity. What is it? Effectively, it's levels of scoring your experimentation program. How good is your program compared to other programs? But also just making sure you're following the right rituals, processes, having a strong culture of experimentation, having strong strategy, etc. We'll go into the pillars on the next slide. But before I went into the pillars, I wanted to kind of just contextualize the scoring of how you progress through maturity. So at the beginning stages, we have things like perhaps you're running tests in Google Optimize, or maybe you're not, rest in peace. Or perhaps you're running tests in a general client side manner. Maybe you're running some very basic tests, copy testing, button color testing. You may not be backing it in as much research. You might not have the right processes. It might be isolated. You might not have the resources. So those are some things that might be involved in someone who may be at the beginner stages of experimentation maturity. But as you start scaling up, you might have things such as prioritizing your tests in a framework that is totally objective, and you're able to make sure that tests are backed in research. And that's important. It could be things like making sure that your tests from a strategic side are linked to the business goals and the business metrics. It's not just tests that are in isolation or being siloed. So that's kind of the scale for what we have here. As you start to move up and up, you start to really lock down on processes, strategy, culture, school skills, all that other stuff. You start to improve your maturity. And what does that actually mean? Like, what's the point of having a good experimentation program? Well, faster and better experimentation just generally means better ROI for the business. More learnings, more winnings, good for business. Pretty simple. So we should all strive for higher and higher levels of maturity as much as we can. So how do we get there? Next slide, please. Thank you. So we have 4 pillars that we have for kind of focusing on experimentation maturity. They overlap quite a bit when we look at some of the tactical things, which I'll start to go into in the next slides and kind of give some examples of the different pillars and some of the maybe rituals or activities that are in here. If you go ahead and click next. So we're going to be focusing on process and governance and data and tools. I could probably spend hours, if not days, going through all of the different tactical things that are involved in each one of these pillars. For the interest of time and the interest of kind of keeping this impactful towards tooling and keeping it short, we're going to focus on process and governance and data and tools for this webinar here. Next slide. Thanks. So the first pillar, strategy and culture. I'm sure we all read all the LinkedIn posts about how we have to build a culture of experimentation and have good experimentation strategy. Lots of truth to that, but it can be incredibly hard to get that buy-in. It can be incredibly hard to lay that foundation. So there are things that potentially have to happen, sometimes for the top down, sometimes from the bottom up. Top down being, from the C-suite. You have to have leaders that actually buy into experimentation, right? If your leader just doesn't want to pay for a tool and they just don't value experimentation, you can run all the tests you want. If no decisions are actually being made on the experiments towards the business, it's almost a waste of your time and running experiments if they're never going to be used. So making sure you have that buy-in, super important. There could be other things, like I mentioned before, making sure that your experiments are linked with business objectives. So you don't want to run tests in isolation where the business is trying to do X, your experiments are doing Y. That leads to distrust in experimentation, and that doesn't help you actually foster that culture of experimentation. But this include other things like what is the actual strategy of your experimentation? Are you doing advanced experimentation tactics such as personalization and targeting? Do you have complex tests that are truly driving business impact, or are you doing, a bunch of very small scale client side tests? That's all involved in kind of strategy and culture here. Next slide. Great. So this is one that we'll be covering. This is one of the 2 pillars we'll be covering in the webinar: process and governance. Effectively, it's law and order. So the law being the process, setting the rules, and then governance is making sure that those rules are actually followed. So if you set in the process that no test under 90% statistical significance will be rolled out as a winner, and then you start calling out test winners at 65%, you're not governing that process that you've potentially laid out. But that could be other things such as hypothesis generation. What is involved in your hypothesis generation? Are you backing it in research and data? Are you kind of just competitor watching? Road mapping. Do you have a defined process for road mapping that makes sure that you slot iterative tests into that roadmap, but you also are thinking about more strategically what are the things you want to do on the site and building out experiments backed in research that support that. So those are just a couple examples. Prioritization framework's another one that we'll cover pretty much in detail there as well. But yeah, the next one, data and tools. So this involves, data is important. It involves the data collection. So that could be on the research side, qual and quant data. Are you making sure that you're capturing all of the data that you can so that your program is truly, truly impactful, backed in research? Um, and then what are the tools that you have? So it might be tools on the project management side. If you're managing everything in Google Sheets, you might have a difficult time managing everything together versus potentially using another tool such as, Airtable or Monday or true project management software. You might have an easier time managing the process, managing all the things that you need to do, and keeping a centralized it could be even a centralized knowledge base creation, which is important for sharing our test ideas and keeping a central repository. But on the data side, it also includes things such as making sure that your data is accurate and reliable, and you have multiple sources of data to validate changes being made or just observations on the site. So these are all things that are all involved in the data and tools pillar here. And then on the last pillar, we have people and skills. We are not automated out of our jobs yet. ChatGPT hasn't kicked us off. We're still going to need people to be running experimentation programs. We're still going to be needing super smart people on the data analyst side to help us drive in, extract insights from tests, extract insights from data and research. UX and UI people are some of the closest friends I have. Smart people, really cool to be able to partner with them to show them some data and say, hey, we have some data. Here's our hypothesis. Can you help us build a design that potentially addresses that problem? So having these people involved in the process are incredibly impactful and powerful. If you don't have this, it'll be probably a lot harder for you to run a mature experimentation program if you're, the one-man team trying to do, or one-person team trying to do all the experiments, all of the data design, all the coding, everything on your own. You'll run into limitations very, very quickly. So yeah, those are the 4 pillars around experimentation. Kick it over to Lucia and Luke here.
Yeah, thanks, Shiva, for that. We're gonna show you some examples of A/B tests we have done because just running an experimentation program will also go hand in hand with growing your maturity. So these test examples we will link back to maturity and what they say about the maturity of this client in particular. The first test is about platform changes, and Luke from SiteSpect will tell us a little bit about this test.
Thanks, Lucia. Yes, so thanks for the intro as well. So I'm Luke Hardwick, one of the consultants at SiteSpect here, working with agencies and customers alike to focus on all things experimentation, really, here at SiteSpect. But I've been in the space for 15 or so years. When I started, I had hair, and it's gone now. So yeah, been doing this for a while and love it. So this example is a good one to start off with for this retailer, this beauty retailer. This is a replatform, as I think you can see from the slide here. And you can run and get a lot of value from a pure client-side experimentation tool. And this is how a lot of people kind of get started, how they cut their teeth when it comes to experimentation. But there does come a point when you'll kind of hit a ceiling in what you can achieve when it comes to complexity and the size of changes. So after just under a year or so of running experiments with SiteSpect, this particular customer was charged with needing to replatform and kind of recognized that the complexity and the importance of that to the business. So it's a big decision, large investment, and presented both an opportunity but also a risk. So they wanted to leverage experimentation server side in this case to manage that risk, to avoid I guess what the industry refers to as kind of a big bang approach to the release and any potential kind of rollbacks that may have to happen if things just aren't working with that type of approach. So not very evidence-based, which is one of the indicators, I guess, of an experimentation maturity within an organization. So this server-side approach enabled a kind of controlled, iterative approach to manage risk, to manage conversion rate, and to quantify secondary benefits as well. So this allowed them to do this across various kind of groupings and, as I said, iterations. So we're talking things about differences by device, by areas of the site, like checkout, prior to checkout, and also even down to the detail of which payment methods potentially the new platform should be presenting versus what the old did, which all had quite a significant impact on the overall performance of the new platform. So being able to explore this, because they provided more evidence around what the right decisions were, what the right payment mixes were, which allowed them to potentially acquire more direct customers, which is better for communication with those customers, better for LTV, lifetime value, and also the ability to kind of reduce even return rates depending on which transaction methods are being used here. So all these things is driving both iteration, which is another signal for maturity, the acknowledgement maybe it's not a silver bullet, first time, one-time answer. You need to kind of take steps to achieve this. And also, I guess, importantly, not necessarily relying on the vendor telling you they're awesome and it's all going to work and just accepting that, right? So actually kind of dipping your toe in the water, but using data to confirm that is the case. So yeah, I think I'll hand over to Lucia for a few more examples.
Yeah, thanks, Luke. So from a super big test to a very small test, we found some research, and I was the strategist of this client. And we found some research. It was a scientific study saying that actually removing the dollar signs on menu and price presentation in restaurants led to a customer behavior change. Basically, I think they also bought more or different types of stuff if the dollar sign was gone. And this was something based in research. Usually, you do your own research, so this is a little bit broader. But still, we were curious and we wanted to try this out for the PDP pages. So, quite a simple thing you see here in the example. The dollar sign is gone in the variant. And the thing is, you don't want to do this with having a flicker effect. And the flicker effect is something that you often see with client-side testing, for example, with Optimize. It's an effect that the code, the change, literally is being injected. And sometimes you actually can see that change. And also, having this flicker and having the page change can lead to a behavior change that you can probably measure. So this flicker effect, it can be negative. It can be that it reduces trust, for example, but it can also be positive because suddenly something moves around the price and maybe it draws attention. So to take that effect out, we really wanted to run this test server-side with the server-side tool. And of course, there are more examples of why you would want to run a test server-side. For example, if you have a really big redesign, if you have to inject a lot of code, you will get quite a big flicker effect. So I think these are all situations in which you start thinking like, hey, okay, shouldn't we do this differently? Shouldn't we have a better testing tool, for example? Another thing here is that it's a small change, and not everyone can do tests like this. Like, you will not be able to measure the effect. That could be the case depending on your data. So you need to know how much data you have and actually what kind of test you can do with that. And I will show you a little bit of an example of that as well later. Then another test is around personalization, and personalization is, well, in a way, it's cutting up your traffic in specific segments, right? So that already means that the effect this test will have is smaller because it's just a part of the visitors that you will impact or try to impact, which means that probably you already moved away from, or you've already been doing for a long time, optimization for the whole website for all the visitors, and probably have experimented with low-hanging fruit already. You see here in this test that for people living in Melbourne, Sydney, or Chestnut, they would receive this special message. They would, get the information about when their order would be delivered, which was very helpful, or at least we thought so in their case. So this is a test of personalization, just a small example, but of course you can do tons of cool stuff with personalization. But if you're, ready for that, it depends a little bit on your experimentation maturity. And it was a winner. Yay. Then some other examples of, stuff around the test. So these were just 3 really tactical examples of A/B test. But then what about those pillars that Shiva just showed us? So just a quick overview again. These are the pillars. And I wanted to show a little bit of the process behind the A/B test. So, for example, for strategy and culture, so we have to communicate what we're doing, right? We have to communicate the tests that have been done, and we often create a slide deck where all the details of the test are. So if you want to replicate that, if you want to test it again, you can. And also there is like executive level reporting in there, so that different types of people within the organization can immediately find the relevant information for them. We also send out newsletters to a bigger part of the organization, just with a very short overview of this was a winner, this was what we learned, to involve more people. And of course, there's tons of methods of how to involve more people. You can create a Slack channel, you can set up meetings. We did also a maturity audit, like an official maturity audit for them, which involved a whole bunch of people and departments. And the next step is also connecting those teams to being evidence-based and doing experiments. And so what we did was we tried to reach out to as many parts of the organization as possible. So for example, the people from brand or the people from SEO team, and we tried to help them solve whatever question it was that they had that we could possibly experiment with them, so that they would get the hang of the process, how that works, and learn the value of being evidence-based. And it was very cool to connect the dots in this case. Oops, sorry, went back. A part of this was it's very important that everyone has the chance to suggest test ideas. So often you see in experimentation maturity that it's about democratizing data, but also the ability to test or to have an idea that can become an A/B test. But here you see just a simple form. But we collected test ideas from as many diverse types of people as possible. So it could also be from development or from the SEO team, because everyone has their own knowledge, right? They come from their own background, and they have their own ideas and maybe different opportunities than you will ever see. So this was very, very valuable in this case. Then for process and governance, here you see an Airtable setup, where, well, basically everything we do kind of comes together and is stored. So if this retailer would have a new person on the team, the person could go in and see here all the research that we have done, all the experiments we have done, if they were winners, yes or no. Maybe this person wants to check like, hey, I want to see all the winners on the PDP regarding pricing testing, for example. Well, it's all in here. We also do prioritization in here, so that's really cool. Here you see an example of prioritization. So this is our PXL framework that we use to prioritize. If you have that big backlog of ideas, where do you even start? So prioritization can be very helpful to start with the right thing. Then talking about being data-driven, also ideas often start from data. Here you see a molecule that we use for our big research project. So when we start working together with a client, we usually start doing all of this, so we get as much information as possible. It's super cool and super interesting. You learn a lot. But from all those insights, you can create ideas, hypotheses, etc. And those ideas and experiments based on data have a higher chance of actually being successful and being wins. Something else about process and governance is you need to know, and I touched on this subject already with a pricing test, you need to know what kind of tests you can run. Like, can you run small iterative copy tweaks, for example? That depends on the data you have available, You can calculate what kind of change you can measure. Maybe it can be the case that you can only test substantial, like medium-sized tests, or that you can only do really big things. And I think, if you have the opportunity to do all, which was the case in this retailer, that's great. But when it comes to disruptive testing, then again, an organization might start thinking again, like, hey, if we're going to test something so big, maybe we need to improve the quality of testing again. And maybe, Luc, you also have examples of types of disruptive testing that people might want to do with a tool like SiteSpect or server-side tool.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess the key takeaway here is that moving experimentation server side, or at least incorporating an element of that within your program, allows organizations to ask some of those bigger questions, some of those more fundamental questions about their technology and their operations, right? So thinking about maybe key or even full kind of customer journeys and exploring what a new version of that might look like really would likely need to be done server side. How do you organize merchandising and search page results with different, maybe even custom algorithms? Again, something that's likely to need to be done server side. New feature testing, depending on the size and scale, may need to also be, on the server side. And typically, even as customers mature on that kind of program and that direction, you tend to find that there's a lot more in terms of just simple kind of release testing and rollout testing to kind of mitigate risk and kind of, really be evidence-based. So yeah, I would say those are probably a few examples directionally that kind of speak to some of those types of changes.
Yeah, thanks for those examples, Luc. That's very helpful. Something else I've been talking about is calculating how much bandwidth to test you have, what kind of change you can measure. We have this tool for that. You can also use the Speero calculator. You can find that online. There is also something called MDE, minimum detectable effect, in there. But it's a bit, maybe that's going into a little bit too much detail. And as a tool, this client used SiteSpect. And Luc, maybe you can tell us a little bit about this moment in time that the organization thinks like, hey, I need to have a better tool because I really don't want the flicker effect, or I want to do more complicated stuff. When does that point arrive for your customers actually?
Yeah, so I mean, just to give a little bit of background, I guess SiteSpect is founded about 19 years ago now, maybe just over that. So, and it's always been a kind of server-side solution. So from the very start. So in the last couple of years, I would say the market has started to recognize and come towards us a bit more in that respect, which we believe is a good thing. It's a network kind of layer deployment, so it moves the effort away from the browser and allows a mixture of client and server-side tests under one roof, and as you mentioned, without the impact of flicker, which can be both positive and negative, as you've touched on, Lucia. So I think customers will tend to reach out and speak to us and join us a bit more when they've kind of hit a ceiling with what they can do with their existing approaches, and they kind of recognize the need to go kind of incorporate some server-side testing without kind of losing, I guess, some of the business user capabilities that SiteSpect also has as part of that kind of overall kind of umbrella of capabilities. So even WYSIWYG tools even are still available within SiteSpect's kind of architecture, which is a bit, I guess, unique to us potentially. So definitely on the kind of ceiling piece, that's a big one, and also performance as well. I guess performance kind of falls into that kind of flicker area potentially, and the ability to deliver experiences to a user's browser kind of as a single instance, rather than having to make multiple calls and things, which, as you said, is a cause of that potential flicker. client-side tools. So
Yeah, thanks for that, Luke. So then we've come to the more interactive part of our workshop. You see a URL here that you can go to, and maybe we can also share that URL in the chat for you. And then we're gonna do a workshop in Miro, and I think mostly Shiva and Annika will lead that. So I will stop sharing my screen here.
Perfect.
Cool, thank you. Yeah, so I will share the link to the Miro board. So people, please try to enter it so you can vote. But I think before we go into this, Shiva, I think Richard had a question when you were going through the maturity pillars about people. So he was asking, and yeah, so he was asking, would you engage all of those listed at once or start with the UI UX to visualize something for stakeholders initially?
I would say they should all be involved in the process of experimentation as you're building out your program. So I think it was like UX, UI engineering, data analysts. These are all folks that can help you if you're the experimentation lead or experimentation manager, help delegate some of those tasks and support the program. You could, I'm not going to try and say you can or can't do it because I don't know you, but probably you can do all those things, but it helps to have specialists involved in all these processes, people who are niche in these specific tasks to help support so that there's a standard, there's a central amount of, not central, there's a consistent process that's being followed on the data analyst pull side, maybe on the data pull side and the analysis side. There's a consistent process followed on like the UX UI side that you're following brand guidelines and you're involved with someone who is and has knowledge of kind of everything happening on the site, or at least can go ask those questions versus, if you're kind of trying to do everything on your own, you might not be able to do everything on your own. So I'd say definitely keep all those folks involved in the process, keep all those teams involved in the process, and use them and their strengths to help you scale out your experimentation program and grow in maturity.
Yeah, I was gonna just say as well, Shiva, that I think the process piece that you've talked about there kind of hits on it quite well. It's kind of the more people you're involved, if you have more structure and guardrails in place for each of those sections and steps and users, then it makes that whole piece work very smoothly and obviously gets the whole business involved with it, which ultimately helps with that culture piece that we've been talking about as well, which is another sign of maturity, right? Having the whole organization involved. So
for sure. Yep, for sure. Cool. Okay. Feel free to, Richard, I hope that answered your question. Let me know if you have a follow-up or you want to dig a little bit deeper into that. So in terms of the workshop here, we have two different boards here that'll be focused in on process and governance. That was the first pillar that we discussed in the data and tools. If you are new to Miro and don't quite know how to use it, if you press the H button, that's your hand. You can click and use that to kind of like move around the board. If you press the V, that's kind of like your select type, move some stuff around within the cards. So just quick Miro overview. So what I hope to kind of get out of this is I'll ask a couple questions that we pulled from the maturity audit. And then I hope that, the folks who are participating in this workshop will go ahead and answer the questions as best as they can and put the dots on there. And then assuming we have technical setup properly, which it may be difficult, and I don't want to put anyone on the spot here, would love to have people kind of volunteer and say why they put or answered questions a particular way, so we could have a kind of discussion and conversation around here. So let's get started. We will talk about process and governance. What I'll do is I'll go over the first three questions, and then y'all could take a couple minutes and kind of just answer it to the best of your ability, and then we can discuss. So again, the first one is process and governance. So the first question is, you have a well-defined prioritization framework for assessing the potential impact cost of experiments, and it's been customized to the needs of your organization. So there's two pieces here. The first part is a well-defined prioritization framework that assesses costs and impacts of experiments. So there might be some experiments that require a lot of dev and design work, and those might get deprioritized in your framework versus maybe low-hanging fruit backed in a ton of research will get prioritized super higher on that. So that's part one. Part two is meets the needs of the organization. So the organization might be flooded with UX people, but might only have one designer. One developer. And if that's the case, meeting the needs of the organization means that the tests that are super duper dev heavy will be deprioritized. So there's kind of two parts to that question there. All right, so that's the first question there. The second question is that test results are presented in a standardized format that is accessible to all audiences within the business. So again, the kind of two parts of the question. The first part is tests are presented in a standardized format. So consistent test results, maybe a scorecard, or maybe something that every test is presented in the same way. So it's easy to understand between tests how to read these scorecards or read the results, and accessible to all audiences within the business. Accessibility meaning anyone can kind of go in and read the data and kind of understand what's happening there. And then the third question is you have a well-resourced set of research methods and sources to feed into the ideation process for your experiment. So do you have a lot of research resources to feed into your experimentation program, or don't you? Don't you not have research resourcing there? So give a couple minutes here, and then we can kind of circle back here. It does seem like quite a few of y'all have answered in here. I think there's 4 people kind of participating here, so I think we're kind of good here. If someone wants to add another circle in the interim while we're kind of scoring through this, that's totally fine. Okay, so the blue circle here is where our client ranked on this list. Lucia, Annika, do you guys have any comments on why they kind of like were ranked a little bit higher on this question here?
Yeah, sure. So the first thing is having kind of this prioritization framework, which they have and which they use. And further on, it's about, the cost and impact of experiments. So that is something we would also calculate for them. So we would calculate their ROI per month, but we would also make sure that our strategy as experimentation agency would, not only be our vision, but it would also meet their business goals and support those business goals. So I think they did that very well. So it's kind of scored quite high.
Gotcha. Which makes total sense. And I think the kind of crux of that to this core question is a very well-defined prioritization framework that heavily linked up with business impact. And that's something that we talked about in strategy and culture, but definitely important on the side of making sure that you have a objective way to prioritize high impact tests based on that research and data. Does anyone within the kind of don't strongly feel a particular way want to volunteer why maybe they were a glass half full or a glass half empty in here? That means might be just put some comments in the chat. Martin, do we know if we're able to like promote people? I don't want to put anyone on the spot, but
I
if anyone wants to
put
volunteer,
people on the stage.
Okay.
If somebody gives...
totally optional, but would be kind of cool to have the conversation in some context. Otherwise, feel free to put some comments in the chat. If not, we can move on to the next question there.
Richard, you have been active. Do you want to ask any more questions?
We appreciate Richard here. Okay, we can go ahead to the next question here. Okay, so test results are presented in a standardized format, accessible to all audiences within the business. So it does seem like a couple of y'all were kind of in the middle as well. It does seem like one person was a little bit more confident compared to the other cluster here. But this was another example of our client here definitely being very confident in their abilities on the presentation of standardization of data, as well as accessibility of that data. Lucia, do you want to maybe speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, so I think I showed already a little bit, like we have that slide deck, we have the executive report, we have, the Airtable is accessible to everyone, so everyone can go in and learn from the tests we have done, the research we have done. And then there's that newsletter that every month would kind of drop in their mailbox for everyone, I guess, there.
Gotcha. Cool. Yeah. As you could tell, some of these things are definitely starting to overlap. So I know we talked a little bit about linking with business, definitely something important on the strategy and culture side. But you can see how these pillars start to intertwine with each other and they all play off each other, that you can't just have a strong strategy and culture and kind of a crummy process and expect things to be working out really well. So this last one, I love to see this. I love to see a lot of companies that are well resourced in terms of research, methods and sources of data to feed into the process for experimentation. It's kind of interesting to see that some of y'all felt confident in this. That's probably around like a 7, 8 ish out of 10, which is quite good. I'm guessing a bunch of y'all are using stuff like heat maps and session recordings, customer interviews, surveys, stuff like that. So yeah, this is kind of cool to see. Lucia, any interesting call outs on, potentially why they felt really particularly strong in a strong prioritization framework, but maybe didn't have all the resourcing on the research side to work through some of those things?
Yeah, I think it depended on the period as well. Like sometimes we would have all the tools available, Hotjar, for example, full access, and sometimes we just didn't, and that was also up to the resources available, and also. But I think there's another question for that. Like they could still improve the quality of data they were collecting, or have a data lake there, things like that. So there was definitely room for opportunity there.
Cool. Hey,
Yeah, so
Richard,
we
thank you
have
for joining us on the stage.
Richard on
Yeah.
stage, yeah.
No, it's fine.
Do you maybe want to speak to, we can maybe go backwards on this because we're on this question. So do you maybe want to call out what dot you were here and why you feel confident in the research that you use?
Well, actually, I was going to speak to sort of the point one around the prioritization framework, if I may.
Sure. Yeah, let's do it.
So I put my dot to the far left, and I would say that's because I guess I could say we're a relatively new sort of product or project within a large organization. I think we have many competing priorities. So what we have is probably a mixture of prioritization happening in different areas. And so as an experimentation framework, we're having to mix multiple prioritizations or come up with our own. And come up with our own is not necessarily sitting well with quite embedded prioritization processes. So that's why I put it at the far left. Like we can sort of take a very pragmatic approach and sort of prioritize if a particular experiment is a particular area of the product, but we can't prioritize across the whole of the product because we've kind of got a collection of teams with slightly different prioritization processes. So that's kind of why I put that to the far left.
Yeah, that's kind of interesting, right? If you're prioritizing within your prioritization framework and you have your roadmap, but your tests all get a weight of like 2% compared to all the other things that are happening in the business, then that can be frustrating to try and get your stuff sequenced into sprints and actually affecting business change. So it might be that you're actually particularly strong in a well-defined prioritization framework. But that to me speaks a little bit more towards strategy and culture rather than necessarily on the process side. That the value of experimentation and getting that buy-in from leadership to really focus in on experimentation is maybe not as thought through or as supported. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, exactly. I think it's supported in each respective area, but it's just supported through how they currently prioritize stuff. So, we'll support you with sort of initiatives that affect our area, but I would agree it wouldn't be as at that broad level. So that's why. Yeah, I agree.
Gotcha. Cool. Okay, do we maybe want to jump to the next set of questions here? Cool. All right, so then we have data and tools here. So this first question is, you have the tools integrated across all parts of your website and product. In addition, the tools are integrated and not isolated from each other. So effectively, you don't have your experimentation tool that runs its tests, but none of that data passes into your maybe data lake or into your other sets of data. Maybe you have full story, but it's not integrated properly with your Facebook ads. So you don't have that layer of kind of segmenting the data there. So just making sure that the tools you have available are all integrated with and talking to each other. So you have a cohesive, you have an ability to kind of comb through and see all of the data rather than bits and pieces that are siloed that may not be as accurate there. So that's kind of that question one. Question two is, you have a customer data platform, CDP, that contains all the relevant data for experimentation. So you're able to do advanced things like personalization and target new versus returning users, or if you're an e-com, be able to target, past purchasers or past purchasers who've purchased more than this, or, you can do specific email targeting as well. So you can do a lot of stuff on that note, but that requires a foundation of data that has to be set up in order for you to do that advanced testing. So that's kind of the question there. And then this third one is you have a robust test management system that helps manage the process from hypothesis generation to post analysis and implementation. So this is effectively, do you have a strong project management tool that manages end-to-end experimentation for you? Or how do you do that in a way that is optimized? So again, kind of, it is in theory a little bit more on the process side, but in order for that process to be working, you need to have a strong tool on that back end to support the ideal process that you need. So that's kind of on that side there. Okay. So it looks like we're missing one for the couple other questions here, but we could start with question one. If anyone has any questions or want to jump in, would love to kind of get some more participation here. So feel free to jump in, ask questions, just provide commentary, thoughts. Would love to keep this as interactive as possible. So the first question, do you have your tools integrated across all parts of your website and product? It does look like the majority is kind of sitting within the narrow bands of in the middle, which totally makes sense. It was interesting to see that our client here did not have all those integrations. Lucia, do you remember exactly where the limitations were on this? I'm guessing it wasn't maybe on the experimentation side, but on other sides that were experimentation adjacent.
Yeah, that and bringing all the data together as well. So data from the experimentation side, but also from the brand team and from the SEO team, they would all have very different goals, which makes sense. But also those goals were measured differently. So there was no overall. It felt like there was no overall tool strategy, or it could definitely, there was room to improve there. Yeah.
Is that something that you think if they had used Airtable or equivalent? I know we love our Airtable, but if there was an equivalent tool that had managed and kept all of the data in a single consolidated source, is that something that maybe would have solved or at least helped kind of bump them up a little bit on the score here? Something that kind of consolidates everything all together?
Maybe I confused two questions, because I think I was looking into question number two, but you were actually talking about number one, because they did have an Airtable, and but not everyone was using that as well. I think, Annika, did you score this one? Do you remember why it's
Yeah, so
there?
I think there was the level of kind of siloing between
Yeah.
teams, which was kind of on the roadmap to kind of tackle. So I think from an experimentation point of view, again, we were kind of in that piece. I think our processing tools were good, but it's just that kind of bringing the whole organization together and making sure that everybody uses the same tools. That was the tricky part, and
Gotcha.
that's why I think we also scored it kind of on that kind of lower side of the spectrum.
Gotcha. Gotcha. So there was siloing happening on the functional team side, which kind of trickled down into the tools as a result, kind of just being siloed too. Yeah,
Yeah.
interesting. I think Richard, you had a comment here about the delivery tools not being connected, but we have a shared data platform where we connect users across the journey. So that's pretty good. I'm guessing you're kind of, for question 2, you're kind of are you the straggler over here on the right hand side? If I had to guess. CDP is one of those that's can be very, very hard to nail, and even if you get it right, keeping it and maintaining it, the connections and the data and verification is almost just like a full-time job for a whole team to just continue to manage. So it can be incredibly hard, but the rewards do pay off if you're able to keep that going for this side. So it was interesting, Lucy. You kind of mentioned it for the second question. They didn't really have the siloing did have some problems there, and that's kind of why the client was a little bit more on the left side of this. That we definitely wouldn't agree that they have all that data consolidated.
Yeah, and also the part of relevant data, because they had a lot of visitors, a lot of data. So that also means there's a lot of management with quality and what will you measure, those type of questions. They were all very relevant for them, and I guess there was always kind of room to improve there.
Gotcha. Cool. All right. And then the last question that we have here is, you have a robust test management system that helps managing the process from hypothesis generation to post-test analysis. Lucy, I know you kind of covered this with the client. They had a pretty robust process, not only on the prioritization framework side, but also in the management. I'm not sure if that screenshot you had in your deck was from the client, but I'm guessing it was like, that's probably what the client's project management system looked like. It was a long list of records, and all these records are all experiments that have been run, hypotheses, research, data points, insights. They just have so much quality and quantity of data feeding into their system, which kind of pull them over to the right hand side. Is that fair to say?
And also, yeah, also something cool is the automatizations we had. So we automate parts of that process to make it quicker, but also easier to use. And we also in Airtable we also would have different views. So not only that big list of things, but also you can create very special views that in a visual overview show you how many tests have won, or where in the process something is. So yeah, there was a lot of cool stuff going on there for sure.
Yeah. It was kind of cool to take a look at some of these scores with the client, because you're never going to be perfect. And, I've done quite a few maturity audits with clients, and it's interesting to see how certain clients will maybe be very, very strong in process and governance, but may not be as super duper strong in strategy and culture. Or maybe they're strong in strategy, culture, process, governance, data, and tools, but then pretty much lacking people and skills. They just need more bodies. They need help, and they're just not getting the resourcing help that they need. So it's pretty interesting to see. Sometimes you just don't have any of these things. Sometimes you're just kind of starting from scratch, and it's a very big uphill battle to try and fight. But you got to start somewhere, and we appreciate that.
Yeah, well, I think that's why the audit is so good, right? It kind of pinpoints the areas to improve, because without that, you would be thinking, okay, we have this kind of wonderful kind of testing machine kind of purring, but then actually after doing the audit, you're like, okay, we do really need to focus in on this data warehousing questions, and kind of breaking the silos between the teams, and then kind of making, taking those steps forward, right? So I think that's why it's kind of very good to kind of have that kind of step back and have a look what's next.
Yeah, a lot of times, some of the clients, and also just personal experience, the initiative is just try and get the flywheel spinning as quickly as possible, get tests running, just try and build a rudimentary process so we can try and highlight some quick wins to help us validate and get more research buy-in, or buy-in to get more research and whatever we need. But so many times you fall into kind of bad habits and you're trying to spin that flywheel so fast that sometimes you need to take a breath and take a look at your process, and the audit can help you pull yourself out of your daily habits and take a look and say, I've been spending a lot of time in maybe process, and I haven't even thought about the culture things that are surrounding the program. And that might be something I need to spend more time on the evangelization side, or perhaps on, like we talked about with the Airtable form, democratizing experimentation and getting people to participate more in experimentation and submit test ideas. So I'll wrap up with Richard's last comment here on the dot being at the middle for the project management. Found this to be challenging when democratizing experiments and teams start running their own. Yeah, so I think that's where the prioritization framework can help quite a bit in making sure that no one feels like, well, why is my test idea not running? It's better than theirs. You can always reference back to that prioritization framework and say, this is why. A lot of times, I mean, I'm kind of having this hurdle in my job right now. A lot of people are submitting test ideas and they're saying, how come my test isn't getting prioritized? And I can go back to the framework and I highlight, none of these tests are backed in research. Look at these other 4 tests. Here are the data points. Here's the research. This is why they got bumped up. These tests didn't for that reason. So having that kind of objective, I'm not the bad guy, the framework is doing what it needs to do, can be incredibly helpful to staple the point and basically take good steps to up-level good experimentation.
Yeah, I just pasted the link to the audit as well, so feel free everyone to kind of go in and take the full audit with all the questions in there. But yeah, well, thank you everyone for participating, and connect with us on LinkedIn. You will also receive an email with the link again to the audits, but also the recording and the slides that we went through today. So have a good evening, afternoon, and hopefully we'll see you around.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, cheers all.
Thanks, bye-bye.
Okay, back to bed.
See you later. Bye.